Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we're going to take on the Second World War story of one of today's geopolitical hotspots, the mostly forgotten story of Greenland in the Second World War. Hi Jesse, here we are again, another week, another podcast. So this time we're going to the icy shores of Greenland. Makes it a bit difficult for me because listeners and viewers who follow us and know us, you know that I like to talk about Frederick the Great and the deep dark woods. I think both of that is going to be a bit difficult today. Nevertheless, a very important, as I just said, quite often overlooked story. And of course, it's one that is really quite hot today. So hopefully we can shed some light on the history of Greenland in World War II. I'd just like to point out again, of course, obviously, dear viewers, we are concentrating on the story leading up to and during World War II. We don't really want to get involved in the contemporary and current discussions about Greenland. So we are providing you with additional information, some context to the entire story that is still unfolding as we speak today. So Jesse, as I always say, where do we take it from here? We always start with a big context.
Indeed.
We always take things back to, ancient history. Where do we start this time around?
Right, so to get us rolling on the story of Greenland in the Second World War, which is an interesting story of resources, of strategic importance, even the Germans make an appearance as well, just to give a little bit of a foretaste. Very, very briefly, of course, there is a Viking presence there in medieval times. That's when this story of Greenland being connected to Europe begins. Fast forward, we're not going to go through all of the centuries, but there's Danish settlement there. And then in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we start to get into the types of themes that are going to become relevant to the story of Greenland in World War II more directly. So the United States a couple of times expresses some interest in maybe buying Greenland, which doesn't work out. But one of the interesting things that happens then, and which becomes a topic in World War II, is that Denmark does sell to the US some islands in the Caribbean in 1916. So in the middle of World War I, US is worried maybe Germans are going to be having a presence in the Caribbean or something. Anyway, they buy these Danish West Indian islands, which become the US Virgin Islands today. That's a deal that both sides agree on. I think it's $25 million. They sell the islands. But there's another part of that contract, another addition to that treaty, where the United States formally recognizes that Danish sovereignty can extend over all of Greenland, which then the US government signs, and the Danes then accept and declare their sovereignty over all of Greenland in 1921. So this is a very slight formal move that the US signs and accepts. So that's kind of the state of things, more or less, when we start talking about World War II. There is a little bit of a Norwegian element that comes into play in the 1930s about Greenland that has an impact in the Second World War. So Matthias, why don't you give us the Norwegian angle here?
I mean, for those of us who are not experts on medieval and early modern history, so this is now getting a bit confusing. But as you said, Jesse, we're going to keep this relatively short. So if you are an expert, please forgive us. I'm just going to throw out one or two sentences here on this relationship. So in the Middle Ages, going all the way up to 1814, so for several centuries, there is a personal union between Denmark and Norway. So basically, it's a bit too simplistic, but basically it's one country. It's a bit more difficult than that, but as I said, I don't want to go into all the detail. And that union is then split in 1814. It's all to do with the wars against Napoleon, the wars of the French Revolution. So again, no need for great detail, but this kind of sets the whole wheel in motion. So who really owns Greenland at that particular time? There's a bit of a debate between Norway and Denmark. And Jesse already talked about the 1920s. This is where this also comes up again, because Norway says, well, hang on, so you've got this territory here, you're now signing a deal with another nation, so we want to have a say in this as well, and we don't really think that Greenland belongs, all of it belongs to Denmark. Either we need to find a different solution, or at least we want to get parts in the eastern part of Greenland that belong to Norway. All this is then taken to the international courts and is settled in 1933. So at that stage, it's very, very clear from the international point of view that all of Greenland actually does belong to Denmark and to no one else. The interesting question then is, what is the internal structure of this relationship? Because you've got the world's largest island and a relatively small country in Europe. And basically, again, in a nutshell, to keep it relatively simple, at that particular time, Greenland is officially a colony. So you talked about some of these other territories that Denmark sells. They're also colonies. Greenland is also seen as a colony, which mainly has implications for how you govern this place. So the government actually happens in Denmark. It's not self-governed, not self-ruled at that time. It has a colonial status. I think that's quite important to understand when we now go into the slightly more complex bits and bobs of the 1940s, what happens also during the occupation. You talked about the sale of territory, and for example, the Americans for the first time approached Denmark, trying to buy this area. That's in 1867. You have to see the context again. For the Americans, and this is something that we can see being played out as well, of course, today, this change of territory is nothing unusual. Roughly speaking, probably, our American listeners can correct me, I think about 40% of the current territory of the USA was actually bought from other nations. That is the Louisiana deal with the French, and of course, in particular, Alaska from the Russians. And that happens at the same time, 1867. So there's a precedent there, and they say, you know what, why don't we then go into this area as well? That is stopped at that particular time by the Danes, say, no, we don't want to sell, this is our territory. But you can see that the Americans, the USA, are already looking at this area. So they're looking at strategic reach. They're looking at what you might perhaps call a little bit of flank protection. So all these things that we are looking at today, again, they're not new. But as we'll explore now in a bit more detail, there are also very, very clear stances, probably from both sides when it comes to this.
Right, which takes us up to 1940, more or less. I mean, this is where the kind of strategic importance of Greenland and some of the jockeying and changes that make the story of Greenland in the Second World War so interesting, that's where they really get rolling, because Denmark is conquered very quickly in April of 1940 by the Germans. And there is still a Danish government in Denmark, but of course they have to do German bidding as far as their foreign policy is concerned. And nobody, not the Brits, not the Canadians, who are a player as well, because of course they're Greenland's neighbors, right, as Canada, and nor the Americans, nobody wants the Germans setting up shop in Greenland through the Danes. And so when Denmark gets conquered, it creates a potential security problem, essentially, in that corner of North America. And then, how do great powers solve security problems? Well, there are different ways, of course. You could create an alliance, have an agreement. I don't know. You could occupy, is essentially what I'm coming to. That's one option. The British, for example, occupy Iceland in the Second World War. So there is a possibility there. Canadian troops possibly could have been sent to Greenland, but they weren't, right? So, or US troops could have gone and forcibly occupied Greenland at the time, which they don't. So, the Brits consider some ideas. You know, should we do something? What could we do? The United States is not that keen to see the British extend their direct control in North America, the principle of the Monroe Doctrine. And I think this is useful to point out. The principle of the Monroe Doctrine is not, when it's originally conceived in the 19th century, is not necessarily the US has the right to invade or control every last square mile of the Americas, but that no foreign powers should be able to extend their control in the Americas. So it's kind of a status quo type of idea, which changes a bit in the early 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt decides that the US should have the right to intervene if a country in the Americas is doing something, grossly bad against American interests, let's say. And that's usually called the Roosevelt Corollary. So there's a bit of an evolution sometimes in the Monroe Doctrine. In any case, that's the legacy of why the US is not so keen on, say, the Brits temporarily occupying Greenland. So these are some of the questions that are coming into play now, because Denmark is not, at the moment it's occupied by the Nazis, is not considered to be the same type of foreign policy partner as it would be if it were still independent. This, of course, causes changes inside Greenland, but I will flip it over to you, Matthias, to take us through some of that.
So we have this colonial status, and as we've now said, and you just again explained, it doesn't really work anymore because Denmark is occupied. Do you really want to follow these orders that are coming out from this puppet regime, you might say, in Denmark? Well, obviously, the people don't really want to do this. So the leaders, the political leaders, so to speak, get together. And we mustn't forget that even though it is a very, very big island, the largest island in the world, the population of Greenland at that particular time stands at, roughly speaking, cum grano salis, 18,000. So it's really, really small. As it is today, still a very, very small population. So you get two of these leaders, well, we would call them probably sheriff, landsforgeder, if that's the right word. My pronunciation, of course, is not great, of South and North Greenland. They get together and they basically stick their heads together to come up with some sort of solution. These two people are Eske Brun and Axel Svane. And they decide now that, okay, the status quo doesn't really work. There is an emergency clause in the law of 1925, and they evoke that and basically turn Greenland into a self-ruling territory. That is not recognized, that move and decision, by the government in Denmark. It's not, of course, supported by the Germans, but this is what you've got now. So it's self-ruling, it's self-governing at this particular stage. They're not trying to cut the ties with Denmark, but in the current political situation, they say this is really what we need to do. And they didn't just do that amongst themselves, these two people getting together. They're in particular talking to another person, and that is a chap called Henrik Kaufmann, and he is the Danish ambassador in the USA. So he is still in power because you still have a Danish government, so on paper that still exists, that continues to work. And he supports this idea because says, yes, that's probably the best thing we can do. And as you just explained, Jesse, he also then starts negotiations with the Americans. So what is it that we can do to protect Greenland from, in particular, German aggression? How can we actually do this? There are some of these underlying tensions that you mentioned. For example, the Danes are not all that keen on having British forces supporting them, or Canadian forces in particular, because they're worried if they do this, there's a small exile contingent of Norwegians there. They will get to Greenland and try to claim Greenland for Norway. So again, you can see how this long-term history also plays a role here at that particular time. And he then gets together with the Americans, says, well, obviously, America is the obvious choice for us to get some support, to get some protection. They sit down, and exactly 1 year after the German invasion of Denmark, so on the 9th of April 1941, he single-handedly, you might say, signs an agreement with the USA. And we get to the detail in a minute. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. What is interesting is that, again, this is not recognized by the Danish government. they actually think that is completely legal and that he needs to be put on trial for this because he's going against the official party line that's coming out of Copenhagen at that particular time. Jumping ahead quite a bit, of course, when the war is then finally over, that's all revoked and he becomes the great hero of Danish sovereignty, so to speak. But I'll leave it at that.
The good traitor. The good traitor,
exactly,
I think, is what the expression.
There's a film as well, I think. I haven't seen it, I have to say, but I think there's a film on that as well. So there we are. So what does this agreement, it's not really a treaty, this agreement actually tell us? Because it is quite important to go into a little bit of depth here and understand what it is that they agree to. Jesse, what does that piece of paper say?
Well, I think you may know it better than I do, but essentially, well, look, let me back up for one second here, because the reason why this agreement is happening, so the reason why this Danish ambassador Kaufmann sort of acts independently and comes to this accord with the Americans, with, of course, the agreement of the new leaders of the autonomous, self-ruled island of Greenland, is yes, on the one hand, it's the fact that, Denmark cannot exercise its sovereignty under German occupation, but it's also because of the importance of the island, which has to do with geography, partly, because the naval battles in the North Atlantic depend on knowing the weather, for example. We'll get into this a little bit later. And Greenland is a great place to have weather stations that allow you to get an advantage in naval engagements, and also for resources, because Greenland is a source in particular of one very important mineral called cryolite, which is used to make aluminum, which is used to make airplanes. We will return to these, but I just thought I would throw those out as to, why is this so important? You could say, it's an isolated, very large chunk of ice with very few people, most of whom are local indigenous Inuit people, by the way. Danes are a minority in the population. And that's why all of this comes to a head. That's why you have this emphasis on Greenland. It's why the Norwegians are interested and why it's important to the Americans as well. So the agreement in the end gives the US permission, certain rights, to almost have the equivalent, one might say, of a temporary protectorate. So they can base some troops there, they build some airfields there, and they send the Coast Guard there. They protect the mines, they guard the mines with the Coast Guard and with US personnel. So it's essentially a consensual decision on the part of the leadership of self-ruling Greenland and the United States to say, yes, we invite you to come and protect us in a way for the time being until this situation in Denmark is resolved.
And that's absolutely right. And I'm looking at the document right now. Normally, we don't read out very lengthy legal documents on this podcast because it is a bit tedious. So I'm not going to read all of it out, but maybe just a couple of sentences here, just reiterating and reinforcing the point that you just have made, Jesse. So, for example, it's 10 points that you find here, and on the very first one, which is always kind of the preamble, isn't it? It's the more general part of of any treaty or any agreement. So this one here, for example, says, after the occupation of Denmark on April the 9th, 1940, by foreign military forces, the United Greenland Councils at their meeting in Godhavn on May the 3rd, 1940, adopted in the name of the people of Greenland a resolution reiterating their oath of allegiance to King Christian X of Denmark and expressing the hope that for as long as Greenland remains cut off from the mother country, the government of the United States of America will continue to hold in mind the exposed position of the Danish flag in Greenland, of the native Greenland and Danish population, and of established public order. So again, summing up pretty much everything you said. So they're still very firmly in the Danish camp. Once Denmark is free again, we're going back. But please, America, support us at the moment. I could go through all these points, as I said, but that would probably be a little bit tedious and a little bit boring. Perhaps the one point that is actually quite important is the one from the very last article, and that's Article 10. And that basically starts by saying, this agreement shall remain in force until it is agreed that the present dangers to the peace and security of the American continent have passed. At that time, the modification or termination of the agreement will be the subject of consultation between the government of the USA and the government of Denmark. So again, it's Denmark, it's not Greenland, because that's the sovereign nation. And the first sentence is really, really important. We'll return to that later on. So once you think the threat is over, this is when, please, America, return all your bases, and thank you very much for all your help and your support. But now we want to go back under Danish rule and basically continue with the life as it had been before 9th of April 1940. It is a very, very important clause, and as I said, we'll return to that later. But
this agreement between the United States and Denmark relating to the defense of Greenland is by now known to my countrymen in Denmark. Sitting by their radios under the blackout that covers Denmark now, they will have heard the President's statement. And they will have felt grateful and encouraged when the President expressed his hope for a speedy liberation of Denmark. And they heard the President's assurance that Greenland will remain Danish. In this world of broken treaties, they know the word of the American people and their government can be trusted.
But this now sets in motion a number of wheels. And of course, as you already explained, Jesse, they are linked not only to the freedom of the people of Greenland, there are other factors at play as well. You are at war. So you might think about naval bases, you might think about airfields, even though they're a bit difficult because the weather isn't great. You're thinking about weather stations, all these things that you already mentioned. And of course, there is also the raw materials that you need for the aluminium. So you can see that things are beginning to shift and change quite rapidly now at that particular period.
Yeah, especially once the US gets drawn into the war. Because one of the concerns of the Greenlanders was, well, if we have the Brits or Canadians on board, we're hosting them as guests for protection, they're already at war, and that, we're a bit worried about that, in addition to the Norwegian question. Well, the war comes for Greenland anyway, because the US gets drawn in. In any case, I think, we can develop some of these themes of why Greenland's important strategically. And one of them, of course, is this mine. This cryolite mine was at the time the largest source of this mineral in the world. So it's pretty important. And, airplanes are pretty important in the Second World War, especially to the Allies and especially to the Americans. So if you need to make a huge amount of aluminum or aluminium for our British listeners, you need cryolite, and you need a fair bit of it. So that's why the mine is so important. It's near the coast. And so you have the US that actually sets up a couple of guns from ships, puts them next to the mine. They have a very small naval, I think base is maybe a slight exaggeration, nearby as well. So they have some Coast Guard vessels there. And now it's important, and I wanted to take the opportunity to briefly quote a local historian from Greenland about it. Maybe there's a slight element of local pride that's involved, but in the Greenlandic world, of course, this is a part of their story in the Second World War that's critical, is their mine provided a lot of the cryolite that's used to help the Allies win the war. And here's a quote from a local historian, Oldenburg is the name. Without cryolite, the Allied forces would not be able to win the Battle of Britain and bomb Germany. Now, I think that, of course, not all airplanes produced in the war contained, Greenlandic minerals, but still, I thought that was an interesting little insight into how it can be perceived at the local level. One of the other interesting things to come out of this period is that the local Danes and Inuit, they form a military unit. And that unit still exists today in the Danish forces under a different name. At the time, it was called the Northeast Greenland Sledge Patrol. And today, I think it's called the Sirius Dog Sled Patrol. It's basically a small military unit. And the idea is they're going to patrol with dog sleds because that's the most efficient way to get around on land in most of Greenland. They're going to patrol these remote areas to make sure that their sovereignty is being maintained, essentially, and also that they can identify any hostile activity, be it, from their point of view, Norwegians operating under German occupation or the Germans themselves. And that begins in the summer of 1941. And there's actually going to be a few engagements involving the sledge patrol, which is interesting. But I don't want to steal your thunder, Matthias, if you are also planning on talking about the sledge patrol. But I think it's a fascinating, unique type of unit. I mean, Canada has some Arctic Rangers as well, who are mostly Inuit, local Inuit people as well. But this is a military dog sled unit that still exists today, that still patrols northern Greenland today for months at a time in total isolation. I saw a video about it the other day. Quite interesting legacy of Greenland's Second World War.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a fascinating little unit. I mean, when they form it, it's only 15 men strong, so it's very, very small. Nevertheless, it sees some interesting action. We'll talk about the action a little bit later on, because of course there are some Germans involved as well. We'll get to that. Perhaps rewinding a little bit again and looking at this period from April 1941 all the way to December 1941. That is also quite an interesting one from a strategic point of view, also a legal point of view, because the population of Greenland has now invited the US to provide protection for this particular island. And you might say in some ways that causes a bit of an issue as well. Of course, they can do what they want because they are, as they would see it themselves, are not an independent nation but self-governed at that stage. But of course, that creates some raised eyebrows in Germany, as you can imagine, at that particular time, because they still see Greenland as being governed from Denmark. That doesn't really work, okay? But suddenly now you get the Americans involved here. And of course, that means it's one of these arguments, one of these points, not the main one, but it's a contributing factor to this idea that Germany in 1941, in early 1941, thinks that the US are already at war with Germany. So they're not a neutral country anymore. They're working with the Allies against Germany. Greenland is not really in the focus of attention for the Germans, but it's one of these contributing factors. The Germans also don't like the fact that the Americans are now providing security for these mines that you mentioned. And because they are neutral, they can't send military personnel. So how do you do it? You take people from the Coast Guard, you officially decommission them, take them out of uniform, and then send them as volunteers to Greenland with ammunition. You already mentioned it. I think they've got 3 anti-aircraft guns, several thousand rounds, 50 rifles, and whatever they have. That in some ways, it's a little bit similar to what other nations have done, where you take people out of uniform and make them volunteers. So there is, from a German point of view, you can create this argument, hang on, what's going on there? Very different from the, of course, the view of Greenland, and also very different, of course, from the American point of view. You talked about the Monroe Doctrine. They are being invited by the population of Greenland, so it's a very different situation for them. But you can see that there are some interesting discrepancies in understanding, shall we call that. In addition to that, you now have some naval support coming there as well. We talked very briefly about the bases. So the US are first putting up 1 naval base and 2 airfields. I said it's a bit difficult simply because of the weather. But as even in 1941, so even before America enters the war, these are gaining in importance simply because of the Lend-Lease treaty they have with Britain. So they're trying to shift more material to Britain. So you want to have another naval base, for example. You might want to have an air base if something happens that you can provide some protection. So in some ways, a little bit like other islands as well, it becomes an unsinkable aircraft carrier. That's a term that's sometimes being used. Not necessary for Greenland because the numbers are quite small, but you can see what's going on there. It's also, as we then go into the war again, jumping ahead a little bit in the pure military realm, these areas become more important as you get these Arctic convoys, for example, going across the Atlantic. Later on, also, then they got convoys going all the way to the Soviet Union. So that becomes quite an important battlefield. As it remains, if I may say so, jumping out of the Second War for just 1 minute, as it remains during the entire Cold War, where this gap, the wet gap up there, played a vital role in the NATO defense plans against the Soviet Union. So you can see there is continuity there in the strategic planning and the strategic thinking.
Yeah, and Greenland is, kind of caught up in the middle of all this in a way. I think I may have slightly gotten ahead of myself before when we talked about the protectorate agreement. The majority of American, military personnel, you reminded me of this when you talked about the Coast Guard being a way to get around some of the, peacetime restrictions. The majority of the real military presence of the U.S. comes when the U.S. joins the war, of course, just so we're clear on that. And those airfields, the two of them, and I think they build even a third one afterwards, they end up playing a small role in the Battle of the Atlantic, because there are some aircraft based there who can do patrols to try to identify U-boats or wolf packs or what have you within the limits of the weather. And that's one of the major limiting factors to what can be done militarily on Greenland. There's one other little military wrinkle that comes before the US fully gets involved, is that the Norwegians are not fully out of the picture, even though they're occupied by the Germans as well. They do send a couple of ships to dock at some little stations that they have on the eastern coast of Greenland, and then the Royal Navy intervenes and puts a stop to that and intercepts the ships. These are not warships, by the way. Intercepts those civilian vessels and destroys those Norwegian stations, because they fear, of course, that it's going to benefit the Germans.
And another use for the Allies was, as I already kind of pointed at and hinted at earlier, was using this entire area as a base as well. So it really does play a very important role during the Battle of the Atlantic. But there's also another reason. I talked about Lend-Lease. You're now thinking about moving a lot of troops and a lot of material all the way from the US, where this is being produced, to the European theater of war. And tanks, for example, you have to put on ships, but planes you can fly. And so this is also where Greenland becomes very, very important in the logistical trail, you might say, of the European theater of war. And I know, Jesse, that you've got a specific comment on that as well.
Well, actually, I think I have two little historical nuggets that I think are interesting about this. If I remember right, and this just came to me, it's not in my notes, so forgive me, listeners, if I've remembered this slightly incorrectly, but if memory serves, there were a fair number of women who were in aircrew who were helping to ferry the aircraft from the US and Canada, sometimes stopping to refuel in Greenland and then on to the UK, which is quite an interesting little aspect of that. And then, of course, there's a popular culture element of it, because any of you listeners or viewers out there who watch the Masters of the Air series, which I think came out last year, and it's about the bombing war and air crews and all of that. There are scenes about the famous bombing raids over Germany. But there is also a scene in Greenland where they stop and refuel their bomber there. So Greenland does get a cameo in a Hollywood-style production on the Second World War, which you can't say that for a lot of war movies, that Greenland makes an appearance. So, on to I think, maybe the most, how can I say, action-packed part of Greenland's military history in the Second World War, which starts off pretty ho-hum with weather stations, right? I mentioned a little bit earlier on how the Battle of the Atlantic, the naval fighting, you have an advantage if you know what the weather's going to be. And the weather patterns, of course, in the North Atlantic, they go from west to east. given, I suppose, the rotation of the Earth and prevailing winds and all that sort of stuff that I don't know that much about. In any case, Greenland gets the weather before it crosses the rest of the Atlantic. So both sides use Greenland to measure what the weather is and predict it, including the Germans. Now, they have to be a little more careful about it because obviously their access is not as easy as that of the Americans or the Brits or the Canadians. But they do several times send teams to land on remote parts of Greenland, set up a weather station, record that information, pass it along, and then they extract those teams afterwards. And each one of those weather stations has an interesting story, and that's where fighting actually happens in Greenland during World War II, which I don't think is a very well-known story. Matthias, do you want to start us down the road of the fights for the weather stations here? Because it's a completely fascinating story. I didn't know hardly anything about it until I started reading up for this podcast. So it's pretty cool stuff.
It is very cool stuff. And as you say, it's completely, I wouldn't say unknown, but it's not really expected, is it? Where you don't expect fighting in Greenland. Well, we have to, of course, put the caveat here. So we're not talking about armored corps and divisions and army groups fighting against each other. So this is very, very small beer, but still, if that is the right word, quite a cool story. We talked about the contingent earlier, the sledge contingent, but it's 15 men strong. So it tells you something about the type of fighting that you get. And of course, in many ways, you're not only fighting against the enemy, you're also fighting against the elements. That's, of course, always there as well. And you already said this, the Germans need to be more careful because where can you put a weather station and it's not going to be detected by the enemy? When you look at Greenland, just like today, the population center or centers, where they're based in the west, particularly the southwest, Nuuk, the capital, that of course was there at that time as well, whereas the eastern part is basically completely empty. It still is very much empty today. It was very much empty in those days. This is also, by the way, the part, Eric the Red land or country, which is the part that we had this controversy with Norway in the 1920s and early 1930s. So the Germans realized that if we need to go somewhere, we're not there to occupy the island because there is no strategic value in this for Germany. However, as you explained so eloquently, it's all about the weather information. And what German weather information is actually, generally speaking, on the back foot anyway, because they simply can't get all this information that they need, as you explained. So it's much easier for the Allies. Weather stations in neutral Ireland, for example, which doesn't really make it a neutral country, and all sorts of other areas. So the Germans say it would be good to have something there. And they from August 1942 onwards, again relatively late, you might say, they're beginning to establish these weather stations all on the east coast. And the very first of these, let's call them exhibitions, perhaps, if that's the right term, was to the Sabina Islands. That is actually detected by the Allies. So they see this. One of these patrols gets there, sees it. But they're not strong enough to do really anything about this. They withdraw. And the Germans then also withdraw before this place can be attacked. So there is no fighting in this area here. It's a bit of cat and mouse, you might say, that is going on here as well. You then have in 1943, in the autumn, you've got another weather station at Shannon Island. And that operated during the winter and also into the spring. And these guys are then withdrawn by air. I mean, that is quite interesting when you look at the distance that they need to cover and you think about the German Air Force at that particular time, that they were able to actually get these guys out by air is quite a feat. You wouldn't necessarily expect that. You have two further exhibitions that are sent out in October 1944. This is really late. When you think about it, the Germans probably had other problems in October 1944 than think about the weather in and around in Greenland. But these are actually seized by the Coast Guard before they can actually land and establish a proper weather station. So they are basically taken out completely. And perhaps the most interesting, and if it is well known, perhaps the most famous is the right one here. Weather station is called Holzauge, which translates as wooden eye. And this is the one that is also established by the Germans. And this one is also detected by one of these patrols. And now we go and we get into some proper military action. So I've rambled on. I've talked about some of these stations. So what happens at Holzauge? Jesse, over to you.
Well, as far as I've been able to follow the story, one of these sledge patrols, a Greenlandic sledge patrol, discovers the German station. The Germans see them, realize that they've been compromised, and go after them. The sledge unit, they got to get out of there because they feel they're overmatched. They have to abandon some of their equipment, some of their dogs. They get to the next Danish/Greenlandic station. They warn their superior who's there, who then warns the acting governor, Brunn. And so everybody knows what the deal is now. There's a German station there. The Germans know that they've been found out. The Germans then, apparently, they attack another small Danish Greenlandic station at a place called Eskimo Nyes, if I'm pronouncing that right. My Danish is terrible. I hear it's a very difficult language to pronounce. In any case, the Germans wreck that station, and the sledgers who are there, they end up setting out on an epic 600-kilometer trek without dog sleds, on foot, to get to Ellis Island in order to get away from the Germans and report what has happened. When the Germans are done chasing the Danes and Greenlanders away, they return to what in English we might pronounce as Sabine Island. Right? I guess these were it was like a city-state that fought Rome. Somehow this became the name of an island. I'm not sure if there's an exact connection there. In any case. And along their way, they ambush a Danish soldier who is a corporal, I think, who's sledging along with his dogs and his sled. And they try, the Germans do, they don't want to kill him. They want to immobilize him so they can capture him, I suppose. And they fire off a burst of automatic weapons fire with the intention of taking out his dogs. Instead, they kill him. And this is the sort of one of the two, I guess, most intense military actions on Greenlandic territory. And the Germans do overfly a station at some point as well. But here we have a casualty. And that is quite a significant thing, I think, in the Greenlandic context. Imagine if you are the family of that Danish soldier back in Denmark or what have you. You're under occupation for 5 years. You know about all of the huge scale of fighting and dying in Europe. You're probably happy if your relative is in Greenland. You think he's safe. And then he gets, the bad luck to have been caught in this ambush, which wasn't even meant for him. It was meant, the shots were fired meant for the dogs. One of those tragic things.
Absolutely right. And the name of this person, as you said, he was a corporal, and he's called Eli Knudsen. That's the name of this fatality there. You have a number of other casualties, and not only mean casualties of war, but actually also, for example, prisoners that have been taken. Say in April, there is a German lieutenant, and I need to check his name, Hermann Ritter. So he is in charge of this particular German detachment. He's taken prisoner. He's then brought back and interrogated, brought back to the Americans. And you have some more military action there as well, most of the time not including any wounded or fatalities. But we talked about the weather station at, I don't know how to pronounce it, Sabine, whatever it is. So the German base there gets bombed by the Americans. They're coming in from Iceland. But by that stage, the Germans had already deserted it. So there's military action, but it doesn't really cause any big casualties. It's then seized by the Coast Guard. But as I said, the Germans had already left. There's also once an exchange of fire between a German plane and an American warship that comes in. So there's another bit of in inverted commas proper military action. You then have another American air attack on the station on the 14th of May, but also in April 1944 you've got another proper in inverted commas land action where 6 of these patrol members, these sledge patrol members, attack what's called the Basgeiger weather station. And there is a bit of a skirmish going on there. Again, you can see in the great scheme of things, it's all very small beer, but there is a skirmish going on. And so there's a German lieutenant that becomes a casualty. So he's the German casualty here. And there we are. And in the end, this station is also then given up and evacuated by the Germans in, I think it's early June of that particular time. And you got one more German weather station, that's Edelweiss 2. And that one is actually captured by American forces, and the Germans there are taken prisoner. And that is in November 1944, if I'm not mistaken. It's the 4th of November. So, as I said, very late in the day, how important and useful this information was to the Germans when the Russians are practically knocking on the doors of Berlin at that particular stage is a different matter. But there we are. You also have a couple of German ships that are seized, so resupply ships that go there. One of them is called the Externsteine. It's a very, very famous medieval area in Germany. So that's seized by the Allies as well. There's not an awful lot of fighting because it's not really armed, but they seize this. So you do get some military action. It's all at a very, very, very low level, which links in with the way you can defend an island and the strategic importance as well. As I've now said before, this is not about occupying Greenland, because what for? That's not important. The important thing really is for the Allies, really, it's the springboard. It's an island in the sea that you can use for all sorts of reasons, including weather stations, including this unsinkable aircraft carrier, and all these things we mentioned. And on the German side, of course, it's the weather stations. If you continue with the weather station theme, of course, the very last German soldiers to officially surrender, that's quite a while after the war is over, is a German weather station at Spitzbergen. So it's not where we are now, but there is a continuous theme. And probably they were quite happy to be either in Greenland and or Spitzbergen.
I would imagine
I'd rather be there than somewhere on the Eastern Front, to be perfectly honest.
No question about that. So there's quite a mixed record, let's say, of German attempts to make use of Greenland for these weather stations. A couple of them work out. They're able to transmit some data for several months or what have you. Several of them don't work out at all and are barely able to do anything and result in just being captured or destroyed. So that, I think, kind of rounds out the events, if you will, the relatively small scale, but nonetheless significant in the Greenlandic context during World War II. To sort of wrap up the story a little bit, I think it's probably worth a mention that when the war ends, this temporary situation also comes to an end. You mentioned off the top, you quoted a bit from this agreement between the Greenlandic self-ruling authority, the Danish ambassador in the US, and the American government that basically sets up this temporary US protectorate. Well, it comes to an end. After the war is over, Greenland returns to fully, in practice, it was always, legally there, but in practice, it returns to Danish sovereignty voluntarily. We already mentioned that this ambassador character, Kaufmann, goes back. He's sort of theoretically charged with treason, but then the post-war government drops the charges, and everything is essentially all's well that ends well, let's say, as far as the Kaufmann story goes. And the Danish parliament then accepts what has been done, essentially. So the new democratic Danish parliament accepts that there had been this agreement with the US. And in 1951, I don't want to push this, I don't want to push us too far past the Second World War because we're sticking to the history, but I think the last relevant bit is that there's a new agreement in 1951 between Denmark and the United States. It's a different context. The Cold War is now the context, right? And you have the Soviet Union that is just across the Arctic Sea and Arctic Circle now. So Greenland takes on perhaps even more strategic importance for early warning, signals, radar, that kind of thing. And so there's a new agreement in 1951 between the US and Denmark, and that leads to a very significant American military presence on the island for many decades during the Cold War. Thousands of personnel at one point, I think 15,000 at one stage. And all of this is a part of this agreement with Denmark that comes in that new context. Because the protectorate, as you pointed out, Matthias, the original wartime protectorate basically says until the German threat is done. And then it turns out there's a new threat. Denmark and the US are allies. So they come to this agreement to face that new threat. And the US had a military presence. Actually, it still does today, even though it's much smaller, on Greenland. And so that is kind of the main elements of what happens in Greenland and why Greenland ends up playing its little role, little perhaps compared to some other places, but not for Greenland, in the Second World War.
Absolutely. I mean, you summed it up beautifully. What else can I say? I will find something because I always do, don't I? That's the way it is.
Of course.
And the interesting thing I also find is when you look at the immediate post-war period, you mentioned all the facts. I don't have to repeat that at all. And you also, again, mentioned the agreement that they had signed, this famous Article 10. I'm going to quote it again. The agreement shall remain in force until it is agreed that the present dangers to the peace and security of the American continent have passed. So to the Danes, to the people from Greenland, well, they thought this is all past. So, okay, the Americans are reducing their numbers at that particular time when the war was over, but they're staying. They still have these military bases there. And that causes some confusion, you might say, to put it mildly, in Denmark and also in Greenland. Say, well, this is over. Why are you not going home? Well, that was nice you were here, but now you can go. And the Americans say, no. As you said, there is another threat. There is still a present danger and a present threat, so we are staying. That causes some political issues and problems back in Denmark as well. So there is an argument, and some people have brought this forward. One of the main reasons why Denmark then really decides to go for NATO, so they're occupying our territory anyway, so we might as well go full in. So there is a bit of a toing and froing. There's a bit of interesting arguments there on both sides. In line with this, you also have in 1946 another attempt by the USA to buy Greenland, and they offer, if I remember correctly, $100 million, if I'm not mistaken, at that particular time. But once again, Denmark says, no, thanks very much. It is not for sale, and it remains with us. And that then all leads to, as you already said, leads to the treaty they signed in the 50s. There's another attempt in the 1950s where the American officials approach Eisenhower, who is then the president, to propose another sale to Denmark, but he doesn't put that forward. He says, no, that's all a bit silly. We've got our bases. That's all we need. But you can see there's a bit of a theme developing here. And of course, we said that at the very beginning, we normally kind of shy away from everything that is to do with current politics and policies. But there is a very clear link in all of what we've said to the rather interesting international political situation that we see today, right now, with regards to Greenland.
Well, I think that's a consistent part of what's interesting and what's important about history, is looking at some of the constants, things that are there over the long haul, themes that return, and then also changes, right? And I think the story of Greenland in the Second World War has both of those. There are changes and there are some constants, some of those related to its strategic position, some of those related to its proximity to the United States and its historical, political relationship with Denmark. To me, in any case, the kind of themes that I'll probably retain from having read up for this episode are the idea of the natural resources, geography, but also the idea of cooperating to solve security problems. And that's a part of the story of World War II, because you have a lot of tensions between different allies. Of course, the biggest set of tensions is probably between the Soviets and the Western allies, but even between the Brits and the Americans. And they had some different ideas about Greenland as well. And then, between occupied Denmark and its own island of Greenland at that time. And in the end, there were certain solutions found that marked the history of Greenland and the Second World War. So I think we can leave it at that for today. Listeners and viewers, I hope that you found that interesting. Sometimes the headlines today It's useful to get a bit of context, to see a bit of history about the places that we see in the headlines so much. It's interesting, I think, and important for us to know a bit about the history behind maybe some of the ideas that are circulating in current day politics. And that's why we chose this topic for the podcast today. And we hope that you learned something from it. If you did, and if you like what we do here at the podcast, of course, we'd be happy if you were to become a supporter of the podcast. You can do that by visiting bothsidesofthewire.com. You can even get access to exclusive content in our war room that's not available publicly. You can trial that for free by using the code Deep Dark Woods. So that was it for today's episode, and we'll see you in the next one. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
Großartig.
Schön. That should be the way we start every episode. Just old man throat clearing. I like it.
Oh my God.